Hello and welcome to the latest Red Pill Fiction Factory edition. Tonight my guest is an Australian who lives in the UK and has done for some time. His name is Hector Drummond, that's his pen name. And I first came across him on Twitter, where he has a large following based around a formidable character, he seems. He's dedicated a lot of his time on Twitter to the COVID scam, and from there he's built up a strong following. But he's also uses his many skills in destroying the global warming and other nonsense theories, things that are going around at the moment. He can do this because he's an academic and he comes from a position of authority in that sense. I believe it was philosophy of science or thereabouts that he specialized, but he'll come to that. And this has given him a great position. I don't know when he graduated exactly, but with the world the way it is at the moment, having this sort of solid base in philosophy and science is an excellent opportunity to deal with all these things that we're dealing with authority. He also hosts a great YouTube channel called The Guff Stream, which comes out almost daily. I think it's 5 times a week, which he describes as a knockabout, rambunctious pub chat type of show, which is co-hosted by another Australian called Simon Roberts and assorted guests. And he's written for several academic and non-academic articles as well in his time. The book we're going to discuss, we'll come to in a while, is his first novel, as far as I know. It was written in 2017 and it's called The Days of Wine and Cheese. It's volume 1. It's described as volume 1 of the Biscuit Factory series. It's a campus satire set in modern-day British university. It's in the tradition of the Kingsley Ames famous novel of the 50s called Lucky Jim, or Malcolm Bradbury's History Man. I'm assuming he knows well of the connections, as well as the more ribald works of Tom Sharp, which I enjoyed as a schoolboy. Unlike those writers, however, he set out to deliberately inject a political dimension to his novel. And I think this makes Hector stand out quite dramatically from every other guest we've had so far. Most of those are red-pilled and sort of right of centre, but not necessarily reflected too much in their novels. There's an occasional comment here or there, whereas Hector's book really goes for the main target in an unflinching and very clever, and I will say seamless way. So you don't really notice the politics. It's more of a perfect balance between a good read and penetrating insights of the world we live in. Anyway, I'd like to now introduce Hector. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you very much for having me on the show, Richard.
A great pleasure. It's great to pay you back in some way for all the shows I've listened to you on, your Guff Stream, and also interviews you've done. Now, would you like to introduce yourself? I've given you a very brief idea of who you are, but maybe fill in some of the gaps and add some of the details.
Yes, all right. Thank you for that very kind introduction. Yeah, I was an academic for many years in philosophy, not just philosophy of science, metaphysics, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of science. And I also work for quite a few years in risk analysis, in the philosophical end of risk analysis. So that's where my sort of interest in risk comes from. A few years ago, I decided to get out of academia, which I've been wanting to do my whole life, really, because I'd always wanted to be an author and a musician. So I decided to take the plunge and get out of academia before it was too late and set up as a novelist, which was perhaps a disastrous decision because, as you know, it's pretty hard to make a living from being a novelist these days, especially someone who's as overtly political as I am. As you said, my novel is pretty consciously political. Publishing is probably the most left-wing profession going around these days, and that's saying something because there's a lot of left-wing professions. So getting somewhere in publishing these days as a right-winger is pretty much impossible unless you've already got a big name, unless you've already established yourself as, you know, someone who's a person of standing, can make use of that. It's basically impossible to get started. You know, agents just won't even touch you these days.
No, true.
What else to say? I'm also a musician and composer, but I haven't been able to do much of that. I've started to do some comedy songs, which I've been working on. Just trying to find the time to finish those off. I think they're going to go down well. And I'm doing, the Guff Stream is a sort of humorous thing I've been doing with my friend Simon, just interviewing it's just a typical podcast live stream kind of thing, but we try and keep it pretty light because there's a lot of heavy ones around, and that's great. So we thought we should do something different. So it's very much like going to the pub with some friends and hearing them chat about whatever they want to chat about.
I think that describes it very well, and good friends too. Simon's also Australian.
He lived in Australia for a while. He was born in Britain, went to Australia when he was in his teens, and then went back to Britain in his 20s. So he's sort of half Australian.
Okay. And did you know him from there or from here then?
No, I know him from here, actually. I met Simon through James Delingpole. I don't know if you've heard of James Delingpole over there. He's a right-wing conservative writer. His brother started up this series of pub nights called... Well, they started off being called Libertarian Drinks, but he also wants to call them Third Wednesdays because the idea is everyone will meet up in the pub on every third Wednesday of the month. And a bunch of like-minded people got together through those things. I met Simon actually through one of those things.
Fantastic. Actually, I'm very familiar with James Delingpole. He's also written fiction, by the way. I don't know if you've read any of his books.
He has. I've read all his novels, actually.
Oh, right. And I'm a fanatic of his, a fan of his, and funnily enough, I'm out here in the jungles of Mexico, and my sister lives not far away, and we're always talking about the latest Delingpole and even the Wednesday night drink sessions and everything, and we're big fans. Yes, very familiar.
What's your background, Richard? Where do you come from?
I'm British. My mother's Mexican. I grew up in the UK. Spent all my life there until mid-40s when I got married, and I was fed up with London. I could see, this was the about 15 years ago, I could see the way Britain was headed, and especially London, and I was looking for an alternative, and having a Mexican mother opened up the possibility of living here, and funnily enough, I fell on my feet. I found a perfect place, and wasn't terribly difficult to make the transition. It wasn't easy, but it was a good decision in the end. And so we're now raising my family here in the jungles of Mexico, believe it or not.
Yeah, I lived in London for a year, and I could see it was going downhill even then. Yeah. It's quite a while ago. I'm glad I got out. I mean, it's got a lot of things going for it, London, but it was just turning into a horrible city and a very impersonal one.
Yeah. It's great if you're young, full of energy, earning great money.
Yeah, that's right. You need to be fairly rich there.
Yes. Yeah, but I think you get to an age as well. Even the money doesn't count. It's just overwhelming, overbearing place.
That's right. Yeah. Yes.
Now you're obviously quite red-pilled. Let's call it that. How did that happen? Was that in your youth? Or was it a gradual evolution, or was it an epiphany at some point more recent?
I can trace that back to pretty much when PJ O'Rourke released Republican Party Reptile. That's when it happened, as is true of a lot of people on our side of politics. And it came out, and although I wasn't a right-winger back then, I thought, well, it looks an amusing read. I remember I was working for the student newspaper, and lots of books came in for review. So I thought, this guy wrote for National Lampoon and Rolling Stone, so he looks like he'll be all right for a read at least. So I took the book home. And it wasn't that he changed my mind so much. It was more that I realized that I was agreeing with a lot of what he said. I would already agree with him. And I think that's what happens with a lot of people who sort of come over to the conservative, libertarian side, whatever you want to call it, for politics. It's not so much that they get convinced by something at some point. It's more that they think, actually, I already agree with this stuff. I'm already there, because I'd been falling out with the left for years and getting really, not for years, I wasn't that old, but I had been getting quite angry with a lot of things the left were doing, but I still considered myself of the left. I mean, I was never very left wing, but I suppose I considered myself on that side. And reading PJ O'Rourke and a few other people realized, well, geez, I think I'm on their side, not the left side. There was a guy in Australia called Paddy McGuinness. You won't know of him, but he edited. You might have heard of the magazine Quadrant, which is a good conservative magazine in Australia. He edited that and he used to write a newspaper column. And I always assumed that this guy was a terrible, stupid old right-wing buffoon. But around that time, I started reading his columns for the first time, actually reading them. He was like this figure of fun for the left. But when I started reading his columns, I realized, actually, this guy talks a lot of sense. I think I agree with this guy. And when I'd hear fellow left-wing students complaining about Paddy McGuinness, or PP McGuinness, as he styled himself, I'd actually think, no, I actually agree with Paddy McGuinness. I don't agree with you. So I think I just sort of came to realize that my getting angry with the left wasn't just getting angry with particular things of the left or particular people on the left. It was actually, I was no longer on the left. It was a sign of a bigger falling out with the left completely.
Was this prior to your university days?
This was in my university days. This was in my university days.
Right.
Do you want me to talk a bit louder? I can come closer to the mic.
No, it's fine. Sorry, it's fine. This was your undergraduate days. So you were then going to be at university for many years to come. That was just the beginning. So you suffered through your entire university career, basically,
I wasn't ever intending to stay at university my whole life. I thought, well, I can go out and try and get a job with just a BA, or I could stay at university for a few years and get paid by the government, because in those days you could still get government grants to do graduate studies. I thought, oh, well, maybe a few more years at university would be a good idea while I figure out what I want to do. Well, I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a writer, but I thought, well, it's pretty hard to just do that from a standing start. If I become a graduate student, I'll have time to write novels in my spare time, after I've done my studies for the day. That was the plan.
Between drinking.
Yeah, the party lifestyle sort of took over, so I never actually achieved much in terms of writing the novels.
That comes out in the book, your lifestyle a bit, I think. When did you transition to, student or of sorts to writer? Or how did it eventually transpire that you started the book? And from the background to that, the context of the book itself.
How did I become a writer? Well, I always intended to write fiction, but it never happened. I wrote quite a few sort of non-academic pieces for various magazines, but writing fiction was something I never actually buckled down and did. It always kept getting put off and put off. And then started a family and having kids, and it got more and more difficult. It got more and more difficult to just even have the career, because my wife had a busy career as well. So it seemed it was going to be very difficult to run a family, both of us with busy careers. So I thought, well, maybe I should be the one to leave then, and I can become a writer and make my money that way. So it seemed like the perfect opportunity, because it was just too difficult to have the two busy careers and bring up kids. So I thought, this is the chance, and this is when I will knuckle down and actually write some proper fiction and write a book. I mean, I hadn't written fiction. I had written some short stories before. In fact, what am I talking about? I actually wrote 4 novels before that one, but none of them ever got published though. So they were kind of practice novels. Right. I think this was the most serious one that I thought, this is a proper one. I'm going to sit down and do this properly. So I did, and to my credit, I did actually sit down for over a year, most days of the week, and actually write it.
Very good. The name, you called it the cookie cutter.
The biscuit factory.
That's a reference to the fact that universities these days just churn out cookie cutter intellectuals. Is that right?
It's partly a reference to that, but also partly a reference to the products of the universities, the students and the academics crumble under pressure. Okay.
You obviously are familiar with Kingsley Amos's work and Bradbury's and Tom Sharp's, I imagine.
Yes, I've read all those, yeah.
They were influential in the...
Definitely, yeah. I'd consider them some of the high points of British literature. I mean, perhaps that's just because being at university for so long, you do see universities as being a central thing in your life. So maybe that's why I see them as important novels. If you've never been to a university, perhaps they won't seem so important. But I always thought they were important novels.
Yes, I think they are.
Especially The History Man. I mean, the History Man. You know, maybe the Lucky Jim's a more enjoyable book. Maybe it's literally a better book, but I think The History Man was a very important book in terms of identifying what was going on, not just with universities in the 70s, but with the direction of general travel for societies in the 70s.
Yeah, that's quite important. That comes out in the book. You like the other authors we've mentioned, chose a fictional, modernistic place to set the scene, the events. And it's at a time when education, higher education, was being created almost out of nothing, wasn't it? It was just being generated like, well, we're just going to make this place as a university from now on, which kind of, well, it's a massive experiment, educational, in the history of education, just to create these things out of it. It hasn't really happened since the monks did it in hundreds of years ago. But it's also created a sort of void as to what to fill these places with. That it's all very well having the bricks and mortar, but part of the theme of your book is that they had nothing to fill these, neither the buildings nor the minds with. They've almost created whole new subject matters and themes and myths just to fill the brains of these kids in these empty buildings, well, these sort of vacuous buildings.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. Actually, there has been this massive expansion in Britain. There were two massive expansions in the late 60s. I think that was true in America and Australia and most Western countries. In the late 60s, there was this huge expansion of the university sector, and then in Britain there was also a big expansion in the late 90s, early 2000s, mid 2000s, with the Blair government explicitly said we want 50% of all young people going to university, which is a huge proportion of the population of young people going to university. And they did have this issue of, well, that did actually happen. I'm not sure the exact numbers, but an awful lot of young people went to university because you didn't have much alternative. There were less jobs around. And your only other alternative was going on the doles. You might as well go to university. So you did have an enormous number going there. And what do you teach them? They can't all be doing physics and chemistry. Most of them aren't up to that. And I don't want to suggest that I'm against everyone getting educated. It's a wonderful thing for people to be educated. But that's different than saying it's a good idea to just suddenly send millions of extra young people to universities when you don't really have anything to teach them, and maybe maybe a lot of them are better off doing something else with their life anyway.
Many of them don't even want to be there. They're just there by default because they're being paid to do it, and God knows what else. The alternative is getting up early and working hard down a mine or wherever it is. So
that's right. Yeah. So there's definitely a lack of things to teach them. So at the same time, you had all these kind of fake pseudo disciplines being created. So it was kind of this perfect opportunity for those things to be forced down the students' throats because there weren't any proper courses to teach them, really.
No resistance. And of course, it's a perfect opportunity, perfect subject for a book, a satire especially, which is what you chose to do. And you do it remarkably well. The whole thing is brilliant in the way it's exploited this bizarre situation where, as I say, people who aren't really interested in education, most of them are there for some other alternative motive.
I think there's a massive gap in the market for university satire at the moment, and even if you don't like my book, there's got to be books there that should be written about it. Maybe different authors can do it differently. But you've got this whole huge sector, a very influential sector, that's just not being written about at all, except in kind of flattering profiles.
Absolutely.
And maybe a few critical profiles in the newspapers, but there needs to be fiction about this stuff.
Well, I was talking to my sister today about this sort of thing, and everything is so politicized now. It's not just academia has always been a focal point, obviously, but if you were to write a novel about farming today, you could write a great satire, because there's going to be enough political interference that's stupid and over the top and ridiculous. Or being a fireman, it doesn't really matter now.
Yeah.
Politics infiltrated everything.
Yeah, and I would have thought the civil service too is also crying out for fictional treatment. I would have thought the British civil service or the American public service.
And yet nothing at all. And if you did present the book to the publishing industry, they would, from this perspective, you would be run out of town. Would you give us a rough idea of the Wren Christopher is your protagonist, isn't he? And
yes,
it's based over 2 years in this kind of fictional, small town-ish modern university, I take it. Would you give us a quick sort of rundown of his adventures, if you like?
Wren's adventures. Okay, well, it's set at a university where Wren is just starting out his lecturing career. He's just got a job at this university called Gravington University, and he meets a few other new lecturers. They're put on a course which is based on what was happening at British universities at the time, where new lecturers are all required to attend a course where they were taught how to be better lecturers, which sounds great in theory, and in theory it is a good idea. It's a very good idea to try and teach new lecturers to be good lecturers rather than just throwing them in the deep end and thinking they'll know what they're doing. They often don't. So it's a good idea in theory to, go through a few ways that they can become better lecturers. But of course, these courses were captured immediately by the left and the postmodernists, and also what in philosophy we call the Continentalists, who were like the people who like Continental Philosophy, which was the sort of stuff that's quite similar to postmodernism, really. It's a similar crowd, really. The people who like Derrida and Foucault and things like that. So pretty similar to the postmodernists.
I didn't know that was a word. It appears in your book, and I liked it a lot, and I extracted the quote that you describe them as fans of European bullshit artists like Derrida and Foucault, progressive politics in the form of a word salad, all made deliberately unfalsifiable. Just to interject with that. So that's an actual term, is it, Continentalist?
Yeah, Continental Philosophy, yeah. And it goes back further. It goes back to philosophers like Husserl and Levi Strauss, I suppose, who was more on the sort of anthropology end of things, and Heidegger. So the European philosophy in the 20th century has been very much like that, deliberately obscure, vague, very pretentious. I'm not saying it's all rubbish. I mean, there's perhaps some good things in there, even with some of those philosophers, but it's quite hard to bring out the good stuff because there's so much terrible stuff in there that it's not a job that I particularly wanted to do, to try and search through it all to find the nuggets. But yeah, it is a term, Continental Philosophy, and some departments have Continental philosophers. Some departments in Western universities will have Continental philosophers. Some won't. The lucky ones have just analytic philosophers. The analytic philosophers are the ones who tend to be more focused on logic and analysis and science. Analytic philosophy, I should say, has its faults. A lot of people say it's very rigid and narrow-minded, and they're probably right to some degree. But having Continental Philosophy as your alternative isn't a great idea either, because most of the people who work in that field, they've got nothing to say, and you go to their lectures and all they're doing is confusing the students, really.
So go on with Wren.
Yeah, so he starts off, I mean, there's various things happening. One of the things is he's doing this course, which is supposed to be about helping new lecturers become better lecturers, but it's just being captured by these sort of types, and the lecturers are just force-fed this kind of nonsense. Wren is somewhat familiar with this stuff anyway. Some of the science people are totally shocked by it. They've never had any experience of this sort of thing. So it's a total culture shock for them. They've got a job as, say, a chemistry lecturer. They're thinking, well, this is all about chemistry. I've done chemistry for years, and I'm going to do more chemistry for years. And they're thrown into these courses and they're exposed to all this kind of bullshit.
Yeah.
It's very difficult for them to cope with. So that's one aspect of it. Other aspects, well, I'm just trying to think. It's a while since I've been through it. just the various, in the philosophy department, there's various competitions between people and antagonisms going on, and there's fights in restaurants and all sorts of low comedy like this. I mean, this is not a subtle book. I mean, Malcolm Bradbury's The History Man would say that's a very subtle piece of fiction, at least it is compared to mine. Mine's more, I'd say it's more smash you over the head sort of humour, with some witty wordplay, I hope.
Yeah, no, there is, and you cover a lot of ground. There's a fantastic passage about a man's inability to smile with conviction. Another one about a failed comb over. There's a whole page on what it would be like to go through a hangover in reverse, which had me laughing out loud. And I guess that came from personal experience somewhere along the line. And then the abysmal quality of sandwiches served at official functions. On the one hand, you manage to get all that in, which provides a lot of humour, obviously. But on the other hand, you mention, and this is remarkable to me, no less a list of right-wing intellectuals as Robert Conquest, Roger Kimball, Theodore Dalrymple, Ayn Rand, and you even got a review by Roger Scruton, which is a real feather in your cap. So
I got
you cover
a half review from Roger Scruton. Because
just before he died, in fairness, wasn't it?
Just before he died, yeah, he sent me a letter saying, "I'm enjoying your novel. The characters are all horrible, but I expect that's your intention." Fair comment. And then a few days later, I saw in the papers that he had died.
Oh dear.
So I was hoping it wasn't my novel that experience of reading it.
He died laughing.
He was very sick, and he had terminal cancer.
Yes.
And I was really upset to hear he died, not just because he was reading my book, but because he was a hero and someone we already admired.
He grew up, well, he lived, I don't know where he grew up exactly, but he lived in...
he grew up in Lincolnshire, apparently.
Which is the town nearest to me when I grew up. So there weren't many heroes from that part of the world. And he was one of them. Very sad and great loss there. I'll give the listener a sort of taste of a couple of passages that leapt out at me. Ren, the hero, the protagonist, who's I think a thinly veiled Hector Drummond, isn't he?
No, well, there are bits of him that are like me, perhaps. I'm not sure I'd say he's. I'm not going to say how much he is like me.
Okay.
That's up for people. The people who know me can decide that.
Okay, he's describing another of his colleagues, and he says, who claims to be an anarchist, and he says, "Oh, he's no anarchist. He's just another hard leftist." They all pretend to be anarchists because that seems cooler than saying that you're really a big state socialist conformist who will ruthlessly prosecute his endless rules using a violent knock on the door 3 a.m. enforcement machine. That doesn't pull as many chicks as saying I'm an anarchist, except for the fat, hairy chicks, that is. But then they want that kind of society anyway. And of the way that research is done, now this brings on to COVID a little bit, you say that it's obvious that someone had hooked up the refuse pipe to the output pipe long ago, and you're all pretending not to notice the smell, which sums it up, I think, in very simple terms. Now, you made your... I didn't know you, obviously, before COVID. I don't suppose you were that well known before COVID, but you have made quite an impact, haven't you, with your...
I wasn't really well known before COVID. That's right, because it's like you can make a bit of a name for yourself in academia. Not that I had that big a name, but it's like as soon as you leave academia and become a writer, all that goes out the window. Especially given that my academic friends and colleagues were not the sort of people who were going to enjoy my writing. So it was like I was starting again, and I was a complete nobody for a few years. I did become better known because of lockdown and COVID and that. I think I've kind of stalled. I had a whole bunch of Twitter followers in a few months, quite a few thousand, but it all seemed to stall. I don't know if it's because Twitter started suppressing people, or people just maybe just got fed up and there were so many people to follow. So they got fed up with following me. I don't know, but it did kind of stall. And at one point I actually left, in fact, a couple of points I've left Twitter. Because I was getting angry with it. And I do have a Gab account. I went on to Gab, and I do Gab most days, but I've also come back to Twitter because I was hoping people would leave Twitter and all go to Gab, but most of them stayed on Twitter. So got to go there now and then to try and...
there's a bit of a plateau with the whole COVID thing as well, isn't there? The people have settled now in their brains, either on one side of the fence or the other, and there doesn't seem to be any mutual ground to cover. You're either a skeptic or you're a believer.
Yeah, I think, well, I'm hoping some of the other side are gradually coming around. I mean, there's that old saying that people go mad altogether in crowds, but they regain their senses one by one.
Charles Mackay.
Was it Charles Mackay? Was it the Madness of Crowds book? Something
That's
like
right.
that. Yeah, so hopefully, yes. I'm hoping that people are gradually coming around to realizing that lockdowns are a terribly stupid idea.
And I think also round 2 has got to start before long. We've had round 1 and it's like the intermission, because round 2 is the consequences have yet to be in any sense appreciated or acknowledged. And that certainly will, I think, bring people like you back into the spotlight, because there's still a long way to go in this. It's now a phony kind of piece, but
yeah, I mean, they're supposedly opening things up a bit now in Britain. So yesterday, Boris Johnson announced that a few things. So pubs can open properly next week. So the pubs have been back open for a few weeks, but only sitting outside. Schools, students no longer have to wear masks, although I expect a lot of schools will still require it. He says university students, speaking of universities, he says universities can go back to in-person teaching now. I can guarantee you that not a single university in the UK is going to do that.
Is that right?
They're all like done up like disaster zones. They're like dressed up like movie sets, like they're a zombie movie. Just everywhere is yellow and black hazard tape, signs every few meters. The university committees that run these things, from my academic contacts, are telling me that these committees are full of totally hysterical bedwetters who are terrified of students and terrified of COVID and terrified of teaching again. So universities are not going back to normal anytime soon. It's going to be a long time.
Well, adding that to your knowledge of how the system is broken anyway, the university education system, what's your views on the future of higher education in the UK and perhaps the West in that sense?
I think it's pretty much a ruined system. It's not going away anytime soon, though. A lot of people were saying that students aren't going to go to university in Britain now, because why would you go when you're just spending loads of money and getting very little in return? You're getting Zoom lectures and Zoom tutorials, and you're paying £9,000 a year for it. In fact, I had someone on my Twitter today, commentator, saying, yeah, my son hasn't had an in-person class since March 2020, and he spent £18,000 for those 2 years. The thing is, though, a lot of young people don't have any choice, though, because there's no jobs now. I mean, there weren't many jobs before. The jobs are really dried up. It's very hard for young people to get a job in the middle of lockdown.
Yeah.
So what choice do they have? They're all going to go to university because there's nothing else to do unless they want to just stay with their parents. But their parents are going to say, well, there's no point just hanging around here all the time. You might as well enroll at university and get your degree out the way while you can. So the enrollments haven't gone down. Universities are doing fine with their enrollments, despite the fact that they're offering you terrible value for money. So higher education is not going away. It's not like it's going to collapse in the sense of students not enrolling. They are going to enroll. It may collapse financially in other ways because of the lack of overseas students, especially students from Asia. A lot of universities depend very strongly. So my old university, I'm not going to say the name of it, but it depended very strongly on the money that came in from Chinese and Malaysian students. They had very strong links with those countries. So I know they've lost tens of millions of pounds as a result of that. So there's severe financial pressures happening. So that might affect higher education. In terms of it being, I mean, I think it's a ruined system anyway, even though it's thriving in terms of its numbers, because it's not really producing students who know very much.
No.
I mean, the sciences, sure, they're doing fine.
No, I'd go further than that. It's producing idiots. I mean, they're well-educated, credentialed, diplomaed idiots. They're now much more stupid in many ways than the average comprehensive kid who leaves at 16 barely able to write.
Yeah, I'm glad you said it so bluntly. I should have said it. Yes, that's basically what it is producing. Yeah.
Sadly. We used to have to worry about the ignorant masses in inverted commas, and now it's the ignorant elites really that are the main cause of all the problems. Do you keep in touch with Australia much? Is it all very similar there?
It's different in that they feel that they've had. I mean, they never really had COVID to any great extent, being so isolated geographically. So they had some strong lockdowns for a while. I mean, Victoria and Melbourne were the worst. They basically had a fascist state there for a while, arresting people on the streets for not wearing masks. I don't know if you ever saw the footage. There was some terrible footage of people being arrested and forced to put masks on. Other states haven't been so draconian. And I talked to a family member who was in one state. He said nothing much has happened here. It's all been pretty normal. But then they've closed the borders, and it's basically impossible to get in and out of Australia now. Very, very, very difficult. Even the sportsmen are finding it difficult because they're allowed in and out, but they've got to quarantine for 2 weeks every time. So I know a lot of the top cricketers who travel around a lot are finding it difficult because they're constantly going in and out of quarantine. And the Prime Minister recently, Scott Morrison, said, we don't see Australia's borders opening in the foreseeable future. He was basically saying there's going to be an indefinite closure of the borders. The good news about that is that caused a big stink in Australia, and even the Australians who've been very supine in accepting all this stuff apparently threw a bit of a wobbly at that one, as they say in Australia, and he backed down on that pretty quickly and said, oh, well, maybe they will open. But he was saying even with the vaccine, he said the vaccine won't make a difference to this. Even the success of the vaccine won't make us open up. So you're basically living in a jail. Australia has become like East Germany.
Well, it started out as a convict island, didn't it?
Yeah, people make that joke. Yeah, it's the convict island again. That's
right. I have to say, if you step back, the Commonwealth, the major white Commonwealth countries do seem to have been the main target of this. Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Somehow, I know every country's been affected. Well, not every country actually, but many countries have been affected. But they do seem to have been somehow singled out for special treatment. Let's call it that.
Yeah,
is intriguing in itself.
What's happening in Mexico, by the way? I must confess I don't know much about what's happening in Mexico.
The president is a skeptic. He's a bit like Trump was in that sense, although he's a sort of out and out communist in many ways. But you could tell that his mood, his body language is very anti-masks, anti-lockdowns, anti-everything. But because of the pressure and the press and the opposition, he's had to go along with a lot of it. And so we've been pretty badly shut down, unfortunately. Different states have different policies. So a bit like it's in the US, some places have been normal for a long time and getting on with it, and others just emerging now. Overall, I mean, they say there were a lot of deaths, but when you know what the Mexican health system is like, and when you know also how they use PCR tests and all these other things, I've not done any autopsies and stuff. You've got to take them all with a pinch of salt. So I think we're in the middle ranks of everybody. You know, it's not as bad as places like Australia or Canada, but it's and it's better than others. But the great thing about one of the reasons I came to Mexico and why I have hope for it is that these sort of developing countries, they don't have the total autocratic control that they do in the West.
Right.
Too many gaps in the system and too many failures and too many officials, and it's a lot harder for them to exercise that. I think the ambition was there often enough, but the ability is severely curtailed. Thank God. And
So in the Western countries, I think there's various things going on, and you think you put your finger on one there. The establishment does seem to have more control over people and over the media than in say third world countries. Also, probably the West has become soft.
Yeah.
It's hard to say that without sounding like a Colonel Blimp character saying, "Oh, it lacks morals and things like that," and bring back the whip. It's very easy to come across like that, but I think there's some truth in it that we've become soft. We've had many years of peacetime. we've got this idea that the West is always going to be fine. The West is always going to be a wonderful democracy and free, and we're never going to have to worry about dictatorships and things like that. Whereas other countries, like the Eastern European countries, are much more skeptical and about that because they've had recent experience of it, and they're on the lookout for signs of it.
Yeah. For example, in Mexico, no one ever accepts that the politician is ever telling the truth, full stop. So it's a given that they're lying, which is a hell of an advantage. You won't see the way people roll over in front of Boris Johnson and ask to be tickled, even though it's obvious he's lying through his teeth all the time. In England, say. Here, the skepticism runs very deep, and it takes a lot to fall in line.
And what made a difference in Britain, I think, was because it was Boris Johnson, you had all these people who wanted Brexit, like me, were very happy with Boris Johnson. We saw him as a sort of a hero, a great figure who brought about Britain's escape from the European Union. So we thought the sun shone out of his arse, and anything he said went. I think things would have been different if Labour had been in power, because Johnson, I've no doubt, would have been on the other side, would have been anti-lockdown, and the whole Conservative Party and all the right-wing people would have been anti-lockdown. But because Boris Johnson was pushing it, they all fell into place. And it's amazing how many Conservative supporters became lockdown supporters. And of course, all the left automatically supported it because it's like the system they've always wanted, virtual communist control by the state. So I think it was a bad thing that Boris Johnson was in power at the time.
Yeah, it's a good point. I hadn't thought of it, but there's a parallel universe we should be in that doesn't involve him in power. Yeah, it would have been very different.
Yeah, if the left can get the Conservatives, the Tories, doing what they want, that's a great position for them, because that means half the Conservative voters go along with this. I think it actually suits them to have the Conservatives in power doing their bidding.
I absolutely agree, and I think that is the final nail in the coffin for many, that they're looking at these recent election results and saying that there is no political solution in their timescale. If you're 50, 60 years old, it ain't going to happen pretty soon. And because the Tories are seen as the saviours, and they're the ones that are locking down just as hard as the left would. So where do you go to?
Yeah, so you're still following British news then?
Oh yes, yeah, keep an eye on it. I have to filter it out. I get so upset and angry at it that I have to listen. I listen to a lot, like your Gulf streams and stuff, because that way it's kind of a more palatable version when I hear someone else ranting about it rather than seeing the evidence.
The worst thing about doing the show is having to look at the news. And I suppose the worst thing about doing Twitter is having to look at the news, because before that I was never much of a news junkie at all.
And it is dangerous. It does affect you. It is nasty stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, going back to the book then, closing question really. You titled it Volume 1 of the Biscuit Factory series. I presume that means there's Volume 2 in the works, or at some point we can look forward to.
Well, that was the plan, Volume 2 and maybe a Volume 3. I don't know if it's going to happen. It's certainly not happening at the moment, because once lockdowns happened, I sort of threw myself into that. Although I've had a few periods where I've sort of got away from it for a few months because I had too much of it. I'm still putting a lot of work into it, and just putting a lot of work into just being a general political commentator and doing the Gulf stream and things like that. So and plus I've got kids to look after and run around to various things. I mean, I spent most this evening, I've been taking my son to a cricket match, and so I just don't have time to write at the moment, unfortunately. Right. Plus, the first volume hasn't really sold that many copies, so it'd be a lot of work to write Volume 2 when there's probably not much money in it. And I would do it for love, but I don't really have the time at the moment. But hopefully, it will happen at some stage.
I'm in exactly the same position. Funnily enough, I've written my first novel and wondering about the second one.
And I must buy your novel. I've been very stingy about buying novels recently because the money's tight. So I've tried to curtail my buying habits. I will try and send you a copy. How about that? Yes, but I am facing this exactly the same thing, whether it's worth it to try Volume 2 or not. But we do hope you do. It's definitely a
very well worthwhile read. It's brilliantly put together. I'm full of praise. I think you took on a massive task, not least with the politics angle being infused into it. It's not easy to do, but you pulled it off masterfully. Did you try going through the usual publishing routes out of interest, or was that just...
Yes, I did actually. I thought it'd be a waste of time, but I thought I would try. I mean, these days in Britain, at least, you've got to go through an agent because publishing companies won't really look at you otherwise. Agents just weren't interested at all. No. And I was getting rejections from agents who were giving their names, and I would look them up on the web and see that they were that they did English literature at Wadham College in Oxford, and I would find them on Twitter, and they were making all the usual political comments you did expect. So basically, I was trying to get accepted by the very people who the book was attacking.
I know.
So it's no wonder I had
similar experience, a load of similar experiences. The industry is overrun. Douglas Murray, funnily enough, came out this week, I think, with an essay. It's been well received. It basically says publishing is locked out to anyone who's left of Trotsky.
Totally true. Yeah, it is.
And it's a great shame. But so you went the self-publishing route in the end.
Yeah, some people say, well, that's a better idea because you can make more money from it because you get to keep, 100% of the profits. But true, but 100% of the profits of only a few sales isn't really much money.
No, and it's not even 100% actually. You only get a lot of it goes somewhere else too.
That's right. I suppose the other thing was that, Anthony Powell, or Powell, as some people pronounce it. I mean, he was a productive author before and after the Second World War, but during the war, he found he couldn't write at all. Couldn't write a thing. And I sort of feel like I'm in that position. It's like we're in the midst of a war, and it's very difficult to write a novel in a war, especially a kind of somewhat frivolous novel about university life. So I'm thinking maybe if I do write another novel soon, it'd be about something else. I'm thinking maybe doing a science fiction or science fantasy allegory of lockdown. Perhaps that's a possibility.
I do think that there's rich pickings in the whole lockdown nonsense that we've been through. Again, it could be satire, it could just be a sort of semi-horror film, because that's what it's been like to live through. But there's definitely material there. And there is
material. Just the problem is getting it published, I suppose.
No, I know. Which is part of why I do this channel. Hopefully some of these publishers will realise there are worthwhile books out there, and or a new publisher will have to be in new money. But we'll see.
It's a wonderful channel, a wonderful idea. I'm really glad you're doing it, because there's nothing really like this.
No, there isn't, and it's simple. But we need to start doing this sort of thing ourselves, because no one else is going to come to our rescue. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Well, I deeply appreciate you coming on. It's I feel like I've met one of my modern heroes. So well done for achieving what you've done outside of the book as well as through the book. And if you do get around to another follow-up, let us know. We'd love to see it and review it.
I certainly will.
Okay. Yes. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks very much for having me.
Not at all. It's great chatting to you. And